In the United States, presidential election campaigns are a sight to behold. You've got a dozen or so candidates vying for a political seat. They travel across the country from state to state, doing and saying whatever they can to sway voters into casting a ballot in their favor, with practically every public appearance being caught on camera. And throughout the history of US presidential election campaign cycles that have been captured on camera, there has certainly been a handful of pretty funny campaign gaffes that we've come across over the years. But I think there's one campaign slip-up that really stands above all of the rest. This major slip-up comes from Democratic candidate Howard Dean back in the 2004 presidential election cycle. On a surface level, it's a rather innocuous and inoffensive clip, but this clip would go on to spawn a meme that would pretty much doom the campaign of Howard Dean back in 2004. Today, I'm gonna be telling you guys the story of the Dean Scream.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House! Ah!
Before we get into the story, I want to thank The Ridge for sponsoring this video. They make these sleek metallic wallets. This one is the aluminum gunmetal. At their website, you'll find that the wallets come in various different types of materials and metals, from carbon fiber to titanium. So give their site a visit. There's something in there for everyone. In the description box, I've got a link for you guys to click that'll get you 10% off your order with free worldwide shipping. That's www.ridgewallet.com/wavy and use code WAVY to get that 10% off on your order. So without any further ado, on to the video. The story begins in 2003 with Vermont Democrat Howard Dean announcing his candidacy for president in the upcoming 2004 election. Dean had held political office previously when he served as governor of Vermont from 1991 to 2003, so he was no stranger to politics. Despite his experience though, Dean was by no means considered a Democratic Party frontrunner, at least initially. Establishment candidates in the form of John Kerry, Joe Lieberman, and John Edwards were being groomed by the Democratic Party long before the election cycle began to be the ones to potentially go up and win against incumbent George W. Bush. While Dean performed admirably in the early campaign straw polls, it was beginning to look like he was going to be a long shot candidate. He was seen as an outsider, a relatively unknown former governor of an often forgotten state who had had little to no political capital in Washington. The Dean campaign knew that if they were going to catch the eyes of the Democratic base, they would have to tap into the issues Democrats cared the most deeply about and promise to fight harder than the rest of the establishment Democrat candidates to solve them. And in 2003, the issue that the Democratic base had almost universally galvanized around was the opposition of the US invasion of Iraq. The congressional resolution to invade Iraq was supported by Democratic frontrunner candidates such as John Kerry, John Edwards, and Joe Lieberman respectively. And a large portion of the Democratic voter base expressed disdain for these candidates simply because of this fact alone. Dean, on the other hand, was staunchly against the decision to invade and was an outspoken critic of the war. His position on the Iraq war issue made him stick out amongst the other establishment Democrat candidates in debates, and voters started to take notice of this, and the Democrats would slowly start to rally behind Howard Dean. Not only was his anti-Iraq war stance popular with the voters, so was the way he operated his campaign. Dean had a grassroots operation backing him, one of which was the first to use the reach of the internet to bring his supporters together and fundraise. By the summer of 2003, Howard Dean would begin to rise in the polls and would become an actual threat to the Democratic establishment. Thanks to his ingenious campaign strategy, as 2003 was coming to a close and the 2004 caucus and primary season was beginning to start, the relatively unknown Vermont politician had achieved the impossible and was now the frontrunner for the Democratic Party going into the Iowa Caucus. It's important to note though, his frontrunner status at this point had only been confirmed by straw polls, which are basically popularity polls to kind of test the waters and see how the voters feel about a certain candidate. The Iowa Caucus would be the contest that he would really need to win to assert his dominance amongst the other Democratic candidates. And he was going into this caucus with enormous momentum, and as voting began, early results were projecting Dean to be the victor, but unfortunately for the Dean campaign, as the final final results came in, John Edwards and John Kerry had jumped ahead of Howard Dean and would end up beating him out, with Kerry winning the vote, getting 37.6% of the vote, Edwards getting second with 31.8% of the vote, and Howard Dean coming in third with just 18% of the vote. While under normal circumstances, the third place finish at the Iowa Caucus isn't a death sentence for a campaign. In fact, it's quite respectable. But what would go on to happen that night of the caucus, after all the voting was over, would go on to seal the fate of Howard Dean's presidential campaign. Post-caucus, Howard Dean would go on stage to address his campaign supporters with a speech regarding the outcome of the vote, and within this speech, he would utter a sound that would leave his political campaign in shambles.
If you had told us 1 year ago that we were going to come in third in Iowa, we would have given anything for that. And you know something? You know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. And we're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah!
For whatever reason, this clip of Howard Dean screaming at the end of this speech became one of the biggest sound bites in television history. Essentially becoming a meme before we were even calling stuff like this memes. It absolutely took off. This sound was mocked on late night.
See what's happening? All right. Welcome.
It was parodied by Dave Chappelle. It was scrutinized by cable news networks for days on end. This seemingly innocent voice crack, which came from Dean's passionate post-caucus pep talk, would go on to eclipse everything Dean stood for as a political candidate and would become the one thing that identified him as a person. The perception of Howard Dean was no longer the populist anti-war candidate who was turning the establishment Democratic Party on its head with his anti-war platform. Howard Dean was now just a big joke. And everybody was getting in line to mock Dean for his scream. From Fox News to CNN to PBS to ABC to HIJKLMNOP. I've seen some estimates online that claim the Dean scream was featured on television close to 600 times in the days following the caucus. And political commentators who may have been against Howard Dean were sort of misrepresenting this scream as like a sign of weakness from Howard Dean. Like, oh, he's this high-strung guy that shouldn't be trusted in the White House. If he's gonna be doing some sort of unprofessional scream like this, well, we don't want him representing our country. When really the guy was just giving a passionate speech and it slipped out. This public shaming of Dean's image could not have come at a more inopportune time, because now not only was he facing an uphill battle from losing the critically important Iowa caucus, he would now have to go into the New Hampshire primary, which was just a week and a half later, with a previous loss under his belt and serious damage to his image from the spread of the Dean scream in the media. Howard Dean went into the New Hampshire primary as the projected winner with an estimate 30% lead over John Kerry. But when voting concluded on January 27th, Dean lost to Kerry, placing second, lagging 12% behind. The trend of Howard Dean underperforming would continue as he failed to secure a win in the primaries, placing third in the Wisconsin primary. After Howard Dean lost 3 primaries in a row with John Kerry winning all of them, it was becoming clear that the chances of Howard Dean securing the nomination of the Democratic Party were becoming slim. On February 14th, just one day after his loss at the Wisconsin primary, Howard Dean would officially announce that he was formally resigning from the presidential race. Howard Dean went from the projected frontrunner of the Democratic candidates to a political laughingstock without a shot at the nomination in a month's time. After losing the Iowa caucus, his already crippled campaign was given a death blow by the Dean scream soundbite. Howard Dean would end up endorsing John Kerry, who would wind up losing the general election later that year against George W. Bush in a tight race. Dean would pick up the pieces from his failed campaign and continue on with his life in politics. In 2005, he was elected as the chair of the Democratic National Committee and would serve until 2009, after which he would retire, marking the end of his 30 years in American politics. He did come back in 2016 for a second to endorse Hillary Clinton, where he gave like a half-ass recreation of the Dean Scream.
Because this race is going to be won on the ground. And it's going to be won in Colorado and in Iowa and North Carolina and Michigan and Florida and Pennsylvania, and then we're going to the White House.
The Dean Scream has become somewhat of a cautionary tale throughout the years. Perhaps if the scream and the subsequent humiliation from the media never happened, Dean would have had a legitimate shot at the Democratic nomination. But we'll honestly never know. It's a tragic tale, certainly. The story of how an underdog candidate stood up to the establishment Democrats. He was a man who had all the momentum in the world behind him, only to have everything stripped from him by an accidental voice crack that he had no control of, and subsequently was made into a living meme. I wasn't paying attention to politics back in 2004 when this happened, but throughout the years I've certainly been made aware of its existence just because of how embedded in pop culture the Dean Scream has become. It's often fondly remembered by people who were around during its initial spread, and it still elicits a laugh for first-time viewers to this day. I think part of the reason why the Dean Scream is such a widely shared and beloved video is how relatable it is. The Dean Scream shows us that at the end of the day, politicians put their pants on just the same as you and I do, and that nobody is exempt from an embarrassing voice crack every now and then. Let's just hope yours doesn't end up sabotaging an entire presidential campaign. But that, my friends, is the story of the Howard Dean Scream. Let me know what you guys thought about this video, and let me know who you want me to talk about in the next video. Major shout outs to my patrons, I appreciate you guys. Wavy Web Surf out, peace.